things situated here. I'm really happy to be here tonight to talk about one of my favorite classes, and which is Project Management for Training Professionals. And I like to call it How to Have Fun at the Circus. And let's see if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. So, sometimes you have to sit back and decide what role you're performing. Are you the ringmaster, also known as the project manager, or are you the performer, the instructional designer? So in your previous courses in this program, you've been learning all about being a training professional. Tonight, what I'd like to focus on is what it means to be a project manager. And so by the end of this presentation, you should be able to name at least 3 phases of a project management life cycle, name 3 constraints of every project, and name at least 3 plans. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Oh, very good. Oh, okay. And my third objective for you all tonight is to name at least 3 plans that you'll need to create for managing your training project. Any questions?
Can you repeat those objectives?
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks.
Name at least 3 phases of the project management life cycle. Name 3 constraints of every project, and name at least 3 plans you'll need to create for managing your projects.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Now, a couple of years after I graduated from UMBC's ISD program, I was working for a large government contractor. I was having lunch with one of my former professors, and he asked me how much instructional design work I was doing, because I always introduce, people would say, what do you do? And I'd say, oh, I'm an instructional designer. Well, he asked me the question, and I thought about it for a minute, and my response was almost none. And he laughed pretty hard, actually, when I described to him the type of work I was doing. I was managing teams of people to put together very large meetings and huge conferences for my clients. I was creating websites and knowledge management systems. And he said, well, you're not an instructional designer, you're a project manager. Duh. And he was absolutely right. And what I realized was that was one thing that I didn't learn in the ISD program, but that my clients, it was a skill set that my clients expected me to have. And so I was scrambling for anything I could find on how to manage projects and how to manage training projects specifically. And so that's kind of how this course got started actually at UMBC. I think the conversations evolved, and right about, I guess, 2005, Greg asked me if I could design a course for the program on project management, and after I did that, and I guess he looked it over and got comfortable with it, he decided that that maybe I could teach it as well. And so I've been teaching this course since, I think, 2006 is when we first introduced it. And as I said before, this is one of my favorite classes to teach. I really enjoy it. So sometimes you'll be asked to act as a project manager as well as the instructional designer or the course developer. And it's important to know that these roles have very different perspectives. The project manager is the ringmaster. The project manager is the person responsible for managing everything going on under your big top. While the instructional designer or the developer is responsible for a very specific activity happening in one ring of your 3-ring circus. And so herein lies the challenge. How do you do both? And I think this was a question, and thank you all for the great questions. It was interesting to read your list, and I think this was a question that Bill Banks actually was asking. You know, how do you do it all? How do you wear all these different hats? It's highly recommended that you set time aside specifically for your project management task. You know, you might set your calendar, you know, to block some time first part of the morning or, you know, late in the day, so you can put your project manager hat on and figure out where things are and where you need, you know, what you need to be doing to move forward. So it's really tempting to get caught up in the course design and development, because those types of tasks are very easily measured, and you have a great sense of accomplishment when you get through those, you know, those pieces of those tasks. And sometimes you have to force yourself to do what can be sometimes the sort of tedious project management tasks. So my recommendation is just you know, set time aside to do it, because you've got to do it. So the first thing you need to know about being a project manager is you need to be able to distinguish between projects and processes. A project has a definite beginning and an end, or a finite lifespan. A project also has a temporary need for resources. So we can depict a project as a line which, if you recall your geometry, has two distinct endpoints. It has a beginning, it has an end. Whereas a process is an ongoing activity without a specific end. It has an indefinite lifespan. A process has a full-time need for resources. So again, using geometry, a process could be depicted as a ray, which, if you recall, is a line that has a definite beginning point but an indefinite end point. You could also depict a process as a circle, which indicates, you know, an ongoing type of cycle. So I have questions for you all. Can you give me 2 or 3 examples of a process? You can type it in chat or speak up. Well, a performance review might be a process. Coaching a coworker is a process. Moving your circus to another town is a process. How about a project? Can you give me an example of a project?
Allie here.
Hi, Allie.
Hi. Changing over to a new software
Okay.
and, you know, implementing that.
Okay. It's definitely a project. Anyone else?
You could also do. You could do just
go ahead.
regular modules. You know, somebody says, "I need a learning module to teach code of conduct." It has a beginning and end. You do it.
Absolutely. The creation of a course, the creation of a system, conducting a needs analysis, and following along with our circus theme, probably erecting the big top is a project. Thanks, Allie. So there are some different approaches to the project life cycle. This diagram illustrates a very simple model showing project initiation, execution, and closeout. Another way to illustrate the project life cycle is to expand this model to show project initiation, planning, execution, monitoring and controlling, and closeout. And that longer project life cycle more closely matches the project management body of knowledge, what they present in their literature. So notice here too that the diagram is linear. There is a definite end. So what is project management? In her book, Project Management for Trainers, Lou Russell says that project management consists of planning, organizing, and controlling work. Now, some of you might be familiar with project charters or statements of work, or they're referred to as SOWs. The charter or SOW is the document that seeks and gives approval for the project to proceed based on the information that it contains. The SOW, like any planning document, is evolving, so expect it to change as your project progresses. Approval for any changes to the initial SOW should be sought and documented. The SOW provides important project documentation, particularly if there are contractual issues surrounding a change in project scope. The SOW helps manage everyone's expectations of the project. I am working on a project now. It's a very short-term project, very fast turnaround for a government client. It started in May, and they initially thought that they wanted me to do what they call an environmental scan. It's not quite as involved as a training needs assessment, but it's looking to see what's available, to learn more about the subject area and how it's being treated out in the general public. So they wanted me to conduct an environmental scan, and their goal was actually to have a webinar designed and produced and delivered by the end of July based on the results of the environmental scan. So that was kind of spelled out in the statement of work as a deliverable. And what I discovered after doing the environmental scan is that a webinar was not going to work for the audience that they wanted to reach, and it was not really the best way for them to present information. And I'm making a really clear distinction there, which I try to do always with my clients. And you probably learned this in 602 with Chuck, and I try to hammer it in 603 when I teach 603. There has to be a really strong rationale. There has to be some gap in knowledge, skills, or ability to conduct a training. And if you're going to conduct a training, there needs to be time allowed for the participants to actually practice what they're learning. And in the case of this project, there were not clear training objectives. There was the client really needed to just push out information, and so we discouraged them from doing the webinar that they wanted, and instead provided them with a list of recommendations to choose from, but they were all methods of better reaching this audience they were trying to reach, and pushing the information out, but doing it in such a way that it would people would be drawn to it and listen to it and then follow the advice that was given. So anyway, I wanted to anyway what's going to happen is my statement of work now will have to be modified, and so it'll involve a contract modification and probably repricing of the contract, because it may involve more money, could be more staff time, or more technology is going to be involved in some of the recommendations. So anyway, statement of work is where you start. It tells you, what the expectations are, and gives you a sense of how to move forward. Another important thing, and a lot of you ask questions about this, what is project scope? Bill Shackelford defines project scope as all of the activities and resources required to produce the target product or service. Now, it's important to remember that project scope is never set in concrete. Changes will always occur in one aspect or another. One method for showing stakeholders how changes in scope can affect your project and its constraints is to use a project scope diagram. The diagram shows stakeholders, the diagram is a picture, of course, and that picture shows the stakeholders, who's involved in your project, who has an interest in your project, the inputs such as technology and human resources, and then the outcomes such as your end product. So all projects are constrained by time, cost, and quality. I'm going to give you a minute. Those are 3 constraints of every project: time, cost, and quality. So how are time and quality affected if funding for your project has been diminished? How are quality and cost affected if the timeline for your project has been shortened? And how are time and cost affected if the quality of your project must be the absolute best? So you have to think about those 3 things. Related to these constraints are risk. That's another thing you all ask questions about. What happens, for example, if the technology you had planned to use changes midway through the project? What happens if your Flash developer is reassigned to another higher priority project? What happens, and this is what happened to me, what happens when a government project officer and the original project manager leave a very high-profile project at the same time? That's how one project landed in my lap. That happened, and the end product was due in 7 months. And after I had gone through all the documentation, I realized they still had not yet identified who the audience was supposed to be. So that particular project was quite a bear. You need to work with your client to determine which constraint, time, cost, or quality, is the top priority for the project. Together you could brainstorm a list of potential risks. Then you determine whether each risk has a high, medium, or low likelihood of occurrence and its impact on the project if it occurs. Once you've figured out your risk, then you need to develop action steps for mitigating those risks, and that becomes a plan, one of your plans. That is called a risk management plan. Now, we talked earlier about stakeholders. Stakeholders in your project are people or groups that have some or all of these qualities. They, 1, participate in the project. They, 2, they win or lose somehow or are affected somehow by the outcome of your project. 3, they have an investment in the project, either money or time or some other resource. And 4, they are somehow accountable for an aspect of the project. So on the screen that you're seeing, these are the folks that are typically on your training team. But in that others category, you have to keep in mind that that includes your client, who definitely has an interest in your product, and other folks in your organization. It could be your director of contracts or your director of accounting, the president of your company. There are lots of people that are not touching your project every day, but who definitely have an interest in how successful your project is. So not all of these people will be working on your project from start to finish. you need to be able to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the folks who are going to serve on your project team, as well as the folks who are somewhat removed from your project team but who fall into that category of stakeholder. So managing a project team can have many challenges. Think about these characteristics of a project team. Teams are multidisciplinary. That means members of the team have different technical backgrounds and levels of expertise. It's vital then to define the terms and establish a common language among team members. When we use ISD jargon, and I am the first person to admit, I'm guilty of that. When I use jargon with, say, the research assistants on my team, they give me kind of a puzzled look, and I have to remember to put things in common language and not to use jargon. The folks on my technology team are the same way. Their technology is slightly different than mine, and that is slightly different than our researchers. So we all have to be very, very careful about the type of jargon that we use. Teams are temporary. Many times project team members are assigned to a project on a temporary basis. So you, as a project manager, might be competing with a team member's regular supervisor for that individual's time. A clear agreement must be reached regarding an individual's availability to serve on your team. That takes a little negotiation, sometimes a gift card from Starbucks or something to sweeten the deal. Teams can also be geographically dispersed. A project team comes together to achieve a specific result. Sometimes that team is made up of individuals who work in different departments, organizations, or agencies. In my case, sometimes even different countries. So these team members might not know each other, and the challenge for you as the project manager is to foster communication between team members and to create, as much as you can, a sense of community within the team. And I apologize for that animation. I thought I had taken it out of there. Ongoing communication with your stakeholders is critical. If you've worked with a certain stakeholder before, you might already know that they prefer to receive updates by telephone. Or you might be required as part of your contract to provide all communication in a written format. Many government contracts, for example, require monthly progress reports to be sent to the project officer as well as to the government's contracting officer. The project officer has a programmatic interest in your work, while the contracting officer wants to be sure that all contract deliverables are provided on time and on budget. Keep in mind that stakeholders include your in-house folks who manage resources, money, people, space, that kind of thing. It could be subject matter experts or other team members. So you'll want to review Lou Russell's ideas for effective communication in her book. I really like her book, Project Management for Trainers. It's very easy to use, very easy to read, and very, very common sense. So she gives some ideas for effective communications in her book. In my class, I have students create a stakeholder communication plan template. And on that template, I ask them to indicate whether a stakeholder's interest in the project is to increase revenue, avoid cost, or improve service. That helps the project team see what the business objectives are. And so we go through an exercise where they do that, and then they indicate the goal of each stakeholder, like why are they in particular interested in your project. And then we have a communications column which lists the information needs to be communicated to the stakeholder, and in final column, it's how frequently that communication should occur. So there's some stakeholders where it's okay to give them a quick phone call. Other stakeholders may just be interested in your final project report. So a communications plan just tells you how you're going to manage all the lines of communication throughout your project and with all of your stakeholders. Now, another very important project planning tool is the work breakdown structure, or WBS. A WBS is created by breaking down the project into manageable pieces or chunks that can be estimated, costed, and assigned to team members or vendors. You might want to start with a simple decomposition tree, assigning each task and subtask to a rectangular box and showing its relationship to the entire project, much like an organization chart. And this is just one way to do WBS. Lots of folks will do them in an Excel spreadsheet. A WBS can also be created using project management tools as well. The typical benefits of the WBS include a clear understanding and statement of the objectives and scope of the endeavor, in terms of its hierarchical decomposition. It's a way of reporting work plans to executive management and to your client. It provides a visual summary of the status of the work to be done. It clarifies the logical relationships between and among work units and work products. And it provides support for planning and for work assignments. We had a guest speaker in our class last fall semester, and she was telling us that she uses her work breakdown structure. That is her key document, her go-to document to manage all of her projects. She feels as though she's able to look at a task and the subtask and just check things off the list, or make notations as to where those subtasks stand. Any questions on that?
Deb, this is Michelle. I had a question about...
Oh, I see. Okay.
I'm sorry, you can see the question?
Yeah, now I can. You know what, Michelle?
Oh, okay.
I am not familiar with this GoToWebinar, and I was looking in the wrong place for messages. I thought, nobody's asking me any questions. Let's see. Would communications be considered one of the 3 plans you need to manage training products? Absolutely.
Okay, and then just as a follow-up, was the work breakdown structure the 3rd plan?
That is another type of plan.
Okay, thank you.
And so you said your 3rd plan. What was your first one?
The risk management plan.
Very good.
Thank you.
You get an A. Thank you.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! Okay, here's another type of plan, a budget. More often than not, you'll need to work within a budget. Oftentimes your organization will have templates or worksheets that will help you prepare your budget. The budget is your very best guess about how much money will be spent for your project. You'll probably have the opportunity to look at actual expenses or income each month and compare those to your budget. And that helps you see whether you're on track as far as the cost of your project goes. Some items that are included in your budget are labor costs, supplies, telephone, software, all sorts of things listed on this slide, and other things too. Whenever I'm asked to help with pricing or to help put together a budget, I'm always surprised that as many times as we've done this, there's always something that we forget to add. So you really have to think very carefully what is going to cost you money. One thing, I'll just throw this out there on this project I was working on for the government. They decided that if they did a webinar, it would need to be closed captioned. and that's not a free feature on WebEx, which we use. I'm not sure how it is on GoToWebinar, but the companies actually have another vendor that they contract out to do the closed captioning for your webinars. So that was an additional cost that we caught at the very last minute, and we're able to add it to our budget. Most organizations will add fees to these items to cover overhead expenses, such as office, rent, utilities, insurance, advertising, legal expenses, that kind of stuff. So you need to find out from someone in your accounting or budget office what these fees are and how they're going to impact your budget. I was managing a project a number of years ago and was under the impression that one of my IT developers was an employee. He had a desk in our office building. He showed up to work every day, and he was bid on the project, and I assumed that he was one of ours. And it turned out that he was not one of ours. So not only were we paying an hourly rate for him, we were actually also paying an additional fee to the company that he worked for. And that severely impacted my already very tight budget. That was he was a resource that I was not able to select someone else put together members of the team. And sadly, I had to then kind of manage to a very restricted budget for that. So you have to ask questions and be aware of how your budget is going to be impacted. Now, Lou Russell provides these guidelines for estimating the amount of time it takes to develop training. So I'm going to give you a minute to look at this, see how much time it takes to design instructor-led training and computer-based training. Are there any surprises there?
Wow.
What's the wow?
I just didn't realize it was so many hours of development, for that 1 hour of instruction. But then when you think about it, it just kind of goes past you unless, like you say, you actually sit down and document that, because you're on autopilot when you're doing it.
Absolutely.
This is Maureen.
Hi, Maureen.
I wasn't really surprised because I'm a classroom teacher, and even though I spend a lot of time planning for lessons, you as a human, you adjust and you adapt things naturally based on what you know about learning or subject matter, which if you want the computer to do those types of things and make those types of decisions, you have to think ahead of time, which means you have to plan all of those situations or so forth, actions into your computer-based training.
Right. Right, and I actually think this estimate is kind of low for the computer-based training. I've been trying to document it for any computer-based, web-based training that I design, and I think sometimes it runs closer to 300 hours for development, depending on the complexity of the project.
I have to agree on this. I was actually working on a project that consists of both instructor-led and computer-based training. The one thing that you have to worry about with computer-based training is the environment around you.
Right.
The course that I was creating involved audio, so there are things that are beyond your control. Let's say if the AC unit goes on, or if there's a intercom message being made to the entire building. Well, if you're like 75% through your audio, you're going to have to basically stop and start all over again. It's probably one of the most frustrating things I've come across. And the instructor-led training is very simple because all you're doing is taking screenshots and basically putting the verbiage to it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and Lou Russell says there are a couple of things that can impact these numbers, and you all have actually kind of touched on them. The first thing is expertise. How well does the designer or the developer know the content? How proficient is the developer with the software that's being used? So Russell suggests using a range of factors. She says 0.5 to represent people with a great deal of expertise, and a factor of 4.0 for people with no expertise. So, you multiply that 15 by, somewhere in that range of numbers, depending on the level of expertise. Then she says you have to think about project-related work. She suggests adding extra time for communications. If there are 2 people on my project and we both share an office, I might multiply my time estimate by, 0.1. However, if the number of people on my project is large and we're not co-located, then I might have to adjust my time estimate by 0.2. She also says you have to look at environmental factors. Environmental factors are everyday events of work that are not project related, such as checking and responding to voicemail and email, illness, vacation, company meetings, having to start work over, like as Bill said, because of noises in the office. Russell says that about 25% of everyone's work day is spent on non-project related activities. So she recommends making a final adjustment to your estimate by multiplying your time estimate by 0.25. So, these numbers vary. There's a range. And in class, we kind of work through an exercise to figure out what it might actually take to do a project. So it's important to keep in mind that these methods of estimation convert your duration to elapsed time. And a project with a duration of 40 hours might actually take 800 or 200% more. It might actually take 800 hours or 200% more to complete. Underestimating the actual time it takes to see a project through to completion is the most common mistake made by managers, and certainly one you want to avoid. I know people who have lost jobs because they have consistently underestimated the amount of time it takes to do a job. You're not the only one on the team working on your project, and while you may be a Speedy Gonzales in putting things together, someone else on your team might require a little bit more time to do it. So you have to allow for that as well. I was working on a project that was had a really quick deadline, and I had a research assistant assigned to the team, and it turned out that she was going to be on vacation right in the prime time, right when I needed her for 2 weeks. And they couldn't find anybody on staff to replace her, so I ended up having to do my job and her job as well while she was on vacation. So unfortunately, she wasn't billable to the project. We were hoping to keep her billable, but it didn't work out that way. So you never know when that stuff's gonna happen. So once you've determined what your elapsed time will be, then your next step is to diagram the critical path. The critical path is the longest path in the schedule. We call it critical because any slippage in any of the tasks along the path will cause slippage to the entire project. The shortest path has slack time, which is the difference between the longest path and the shortest path. So in this example that I'm showing on the screen, which path is critical? Anybody want to volunteer?
Going from T1.
The path from T5 to T8.
I'm sorry, T5 to T8 is which path?
Longest? Most critical.
T5 to T8 is actually the shortest. And that's where you're going to have slack time.
T1 to T6.
I would say T3 because you're at a crossroads and you have to make a decision on what direction the project's going to go, and then you have to adapt to changes.
Okay. Your critical path is T1, T2, T3, and here's that critical juncture that Bill was referring to. We see that T6 is going to take us 15, let's say 15 minutes of time, and but T7 is going to take 25 minutes of time. So you would have to go from T3 to T7. That is actually your critical path. So if anything gets messed up in that path, it's going to push your project out. Now what we mean by the slack time, if you look at T5 through T8, that's 15 units of time compared to your critical path, which is 60 units of time. So your slack time for the whole project is 45 units. It's the 60 minus the 15. So this was a very simple project, but some of them get pretty complicated, and you want to look at your critical path because you want to be prepared to react if something causes a slip up there, let's say between task 2 and task 3. If there's a delay there, you may have to do some quick pedaling to get your project back on track. So now some of you are probably wondering how the charts you see in Microsoft Office project software fits into all of this. MS project software allows you to see your work breakdown structure, your WBS, as a Gantt chart. A Gantt chart is a type of bar chart that lists tasks in a project on a timeline with their interdependencies. It often also shows who's responsible for what task. It's especially useful for planning tasks in a project and monitoring progress as the project goes on. Gantt charts emphasize time rather than task relationships. So in the class that I teach, I do not teach a class in Microsoft Office Project. I teach pen and paper. You should be able to sketch things out, you should be able to write things out, type things out, create diagrams, using the tools that you have available. One activity that I have the students do is to look for and post software that they find online, project management software. And I ask them to write a description of the software and if they would use it and why they would use it. And a lot of them, well, for example, Google. You can find a lot of project management software within Google, I want to say Google Docs, I don't recall. But Google has project management software that you can use for free. It's not quite as robust as Microsoft Office Project, but it gets the job done. So if you're interested in using software to help manage your projects, you could look at some free resources if you don't have access to, a more robust product. Now, I said that the Gantt chart emphasizes time rather than task relationships. You would use the critical path to stay focused on dependencies of the task. The critical path is that diagram that we looked at previously, while you use the Gantt chart to monitor elapsed time and how much work each person has been assigned, because you don't want your resources stretched too thin. I know some organizations have some really, I'm going to say complex, but they have project management systems that talk to each other. So if I was managing a project and I had, let's say Rolanda was working on my project with me, but she was also working on Kimberly's project, Kimberly's software and my software could sort of match up, and we could see whether Rolanda was being overstretched. She had too many commitments on her plate. I have not used software that way, but I understand that it can be done. So now that you've got all your plans in place and you've implemented your project, you are in what we call the monitoring and controlling phase. You are working your plans and you're making adjustments as you go along. And then, uh-oh, a big change happens. And you don't want to get caught off guard. So earlier I spoke about the importance of identifying risk scenarios for your project, and creating a detailed risk management plan. You have to think about things like, what is the likelihood that your Flash developer gets reassigned? What happens? What would happen to your e-learning project if that occurred? What's the likelihood that your client contact, would get transferred or, take a new job? What do you do then? In any instance, what do you do to avoid costly overruns and delays? You need to be able to react fairly quickly. You want to have a change management plan in place so that your reactions to change can be less knee-jerk and more, I've got this covered. And so now that your team has completed its project, it's important to share the lessons you've learned from the project to establish best practices, to avoid similar mistakes in future projects, and to acknowledge team members for jobs well done. As appropriate, you want to include your stakeholders in your project closeout activities. So I think now you should be able to name at least 3 phases of a project management life cycle. They were early on in the slide. Go ahead.
Initiation.
Very good.
Execution.
Uh-huh.
Closeout.
Very good. Excellent. How about 3 constraints of every project?
Time, cost, and quality.
Very good. Those are very important things to keep in mind. And then 3 plans that you'll need to create for managing your project. There are many plans, and I'm asking you to name 3.
Risk. Budget.
Okay. Budget.
Stakeholder.
Communications.
Communications. Stakeholders. Mm-hmm.
Very
good. Anyone have anything else to add?
Did somebody say work breakdown?
Yeah, work breakdown structure. That's a good plan to have. So that's my presentation for this evening. Do you have any questions for me? That was a very high-level overview of some of the topics that we cover in the EDUC 689 that I teach in the fall.
Yeah, I do have one question for you.
Okay.
You sound like you've kind of done some of the same work that I'm in consulting.
Uh-huh.
And I know that sometimes the government can want certain things, certain ways, and it's out of our limitation. For our company, it's like, I can't describe it, but it's like sometimes they want things and really we shouldn't be doing it. And I was just wondering how you manage to set limitations for the government, if that makes sense.
They ask you to do something and you don't have the resources
Yes.
to do it?
Yes, or there's something that, they don't really understand, that it takes time or different things like that. And, it's like you kind of, like where I work for a company called Deloitte, and we have what you call an engagement manager. We have a project manager. The engagement manager is supposed to be the one that kind of relays back and forth from the government to the contracting team. And sometimes the government has certain demands or wants certain things that we can't deliver, or at least at that moment we can't offer what they want. And I was just wondering, is there anything that you do in particular to set limitations? Because remember, you don't want to lose that contract. I guess
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that's like your utmost importance. You try to give them everything they ask for because you don't want to lose that contract when it comes up for rebid. So I was just wondering, have you ever ran into a situation where, you know, you didn't want to jeopardize the contract, but it was something out of the reach of your whim of what you can do for them?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you a story. And when I was working for a different contractor, I went to a big meeting. He was trying to sell a product that we had developed, and he asked me to go to this meeting with him. And so we're in this room, it's just filled with all kinds of people. And so he was describing his company and the type of work that he did, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, some woman at the end of the table says, "I'm confused. What is it that you do?" And he looked at her and said, "Anything you want." I just kind of wanted to slide under the table. I think that, you know, depending on your level in the organization, you have to do the best you can to educate the people who are developing the business for you. And, you know, that might be your, what was the other person you described? Not the project manager, the other?
Engagement manager.
Oh, the engagement manager. Yes. It might be that you have to educate the engagement manager about the capabilities within your department, let's say. And the better educated your entire team is on, you know, what your competencies are and what your capabilities are and what your resources are, the better off you'll be. I've been in that situation too, where they, you know, someone else has promised the client the moon and the stars, and, you know, you might have one, you know, tiny little ray of light to offer. But it is possible, you know, to find an outside vendor who might fill that gap for you. You know, you create a subcontract, and so your company would still get all the glory, but you've got somebody else doing the work. Now, granted, you're paying for it, but that's one way to handle that, Kimberly.
Okay.
You all had a lot of other questions here on the list, and I'm not quite sure, you know, how much you want to cover. I did want to tell you that if you want to learn more about project management as a training professional, then I really encourage you to register for my class. And besides being a lot of fun, it is a fun class. This year is particularly exciting. It's going to be a great semester. Instead of working on a fictitious case study, students are going to work together on an actual project for the ISD program. And it's going to be a great way to learn about project management while creating an actual product for a real client. And has anybody heard about the portfolio requirement that the ISD program is thinking of instituting?
Yes. I've received some emails,
yes.
I believe, yeah.
Well, in this class, we're actually going to create a product that is going to help students manage their portfolio development. And so we have a client, and we have a work group. We have subject matter experts who are available to us. And I think it's going to be really it's going to be fun and exciting, and you're really going to be able to see the fruits of your efforts way into the future. Greg, did you want to add anything else about the portfolio requirement?
Other than the subject matter expert is hard to work with?
Yeah, Greg is one of the subject matter experts, but the other ones are super nice.
Right, exactly. No, I think it's an exciting opportunity for the students in the class because some of you, sounds like you know that for people that are being accepted in the ISD Master's Program beginning for the fall 2012 semester and forward, we are changing the graduation requirement from the traditional comprehensive exam to creating a professional portfolio. Now, people in teacher education have done this for years, but in a lot of master's program, it's pretty new. So what one of our concerns is we want to make sure that students have the opportunity to learn how to create their portfolio, design it, develop it, manage it, and make sure that they will be ready when they go near the end of their program to graduate. We want to make sure that they have everything they need to be successful. So there's a couple of ways, at least, that we're going to do, maybe even 3. But one is there is actually an elective course in portfolio development that I teach. And of course, everyone's not going to choose to take that, but then we're going to have some, probably some online courses. That's my guess. I don't want to dictate things to the group, but we'll probably have some sort of online self-paced courses that students can access to help give them that information. So I think it's going to be interesting because, we're kind of faced with, well, what do they need to know? How do we assess this? What's the process? What do we do if people have problems dealing with the technology? How do you account for differences, even though people might have taken different electives? So there's lots of kind of good, meaty issues there. And I think it's going to be a very meaningful kind of hands-on project that students will be involved in. I see people are chatting in and saying, can I work on this project for my internship? Actually, there's probably more than enough to go around for this. I don't want you to duplicate what Deb's class is going to do, Michelle. But there's lots of things that I need to do. For example, I need to probably revamp my portfolio class because we're going to probably gear that towards people that need to complete a portfolio. I mean, we did that before, but we didn't have these requirements now, so that's going to change. So we can talk more on that. I'm reading these questions. Can you do the portfolio instead of the exam? Actually, not really, because we don't know how we're doing it yet. Because we're still building the plane as we fly on it, actually. Let's see. Deb said, someone's asking Deb, I assume your class is live and not online. Well, it's hybrid, right, Deb?
Yeah, it's hybrid. I think the syllabus, I'm still revamping the syllabus to accommodate this project. So I think it's going to be something like 6 classes will be on campus throughout the semester, and then 8 will be, I'm going to say virtual, but they're asynchronous.
People have asked about, is Deb's class the same as Rafi Ahmad, who teaches Education 683? Rafi's is really technology project management specifically. So while Deb might talk about that, I'll let her speak for it. I don't think she focuses on that. Rafi's class, really, they work on a technology project specifically.
Right, and they're probably doing what they call RAMs. They're probably building. Well, someone took that class, 683. Who was that took that class?
Looks like Maureen did.
Maureen, yeah. I took it last semester. Yeah, we developed a whole course for a client. So we developed a whole Captivate. We had 3 people on our team, but we played different roles throughout the whole course. So we learned all the different roles of what a project manager does and kept records, kept all the forms. Some we were given templates, some we decided we wanted to change them to meet our needs a little better, or things that our group was used to using. And at the end, we had deliverables for Rafi, but we also had deliverables for like our client. And then at the end of the whole entire course, we had a Captivate that worked from beginning to end.
Oh, great. Yeah, so his is slightly different than mine. Basically I teach the tools, and I'll tell you this. a manager is a manager is a manager. The competencies are the same no matter what you're managing. You know, you have to have the same, you have to have empathy. You have to be a good communicator. You have to be authentic. You know, all those kinds of things. No matter what you're managing, especially when there are people involved. And so, if you took Rafi's course, you probably learn things that are very similar to what I teach in my course. We just approach it from a different perspective.
In Rafi's course too, students are supposed to.
Yeah, I would say, Deb, this is.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, this is Allie. I took it last semester also, and I thought it was very interesting in that he provides us with a very basic minimum. Like, he doesn't use Microsoft Project, but gives you an Excel spreadsheet to track a project. You know, so you get templates on each. So we saw a risk management document, and we saw a communication document. We actually had to create teams and actually utilize those as part of our. So it was cool in the sense that you were required to have an actual project and complete it, and you were given these tools to use to manage your project in your team. And I would say I liked it a lot. It was a good mixture. There was a lot of technology. I would say, you know, maybe 80% of the course was focused on managing the project, and you actually still had to produce a Captivate module. So it was a ton of work comparatively to all the classes that I've taken so far. It was the most work I had to do to actually produce a project and track it from beginning to end and meet all these deadlines. But it was really a good task.
Allie, I agree. It was probably the most work, a lot of work. But I think what made it a lot of work was the collaboration that you had to, because you were all working full-time somewhere else. So then outside of your full-time job, you had to find time to collaborate effectively with your team and keep up to date with all of your project management forms and continue to develop and design your module. So I think that, and that was I thought that was a good part, because we used Wimba a lot, so I really got to learn Wimba. So we met every week on Wimba. I know other teams used met on campus, maybe talked on the phone, used a lot of email, but we used the file exchange through Blackboard and Wimba, and that's what we did. And it was very time consuming, but I got a lot out of it.
Yeah, the teams in my classes usually have a preference. There were teams that used, you know, the online classroom, the Wimba, and there are others that, you know, chose to meet at a restaurant because it was conveniently located for them. But yeah, I think this class is going to be, I mean, it's going to be fun, but there's going to be some work. And probably the most challenging part of it is that collaboration and the constant communication, because you want everybody to, you know, hold up their end of the work. It's very difficult if someone kind of drops out and doesn't step up to the plate. It makes it harder for everyone else because, as you said, you know, we're all working adults. We all have a lot of things going on in our lives. So, you know, the more we can share the work, the better off we are.
But it kind of mirrors the real world, right?
This is Allie. I still have, I know you said 6 classes. Deb?
Yeah.
Allie here. So when you say, is it a firm, I live and work in New York City. There's no way I can do anything that's on campus. I can only do remote. So there's no way I could participate in that class, right? Because you're going to have on-campus meetings.
Well, you know, I do, because we do activities. I do lectures, but the lectures could always be posted online. I think we could talk, Allie. We'll talk if you would like.
I'll look into it to see where my elective is going to come.
You.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll figure out how to accommodate you. I like the online campus classes. Rolanda, you were in that class with me last semester, weren't you? Rolanda?
she might have her mic muted.
Oh, she might be on mute. Hi, yes. Rolanda, you took my project management course? Now, when we went, yeah, it's a little echoey, but I think we can hear you. When we met on campus, we did a lot of activities, fun activities, didn't we? I think we lost the audio on that one, Rolanda. But we do when we're meeting face to face, typically there'll be a brief lecture, and then some kind of activity to kind of drive home a point. And usually the activities are fun. So it's a relaxing evening if you have to be on campus. So we did things with yarn, and we did stuff with puzzles and games and contests, and so it was fun while we were all together, face to face. And then you really did a lot of work when you were in the virtual team environment.
Deb, this is Greg.
Were there any other? Hi, Greg. Were there any other pressing questions that anyone wanted answered that I didn't touch on tonight?
Hi, this is Shri.
This is Allie.
Hi. Well, we haven't heard from Shri. Let's hear from Shri, and then Allie, we'll come back to you.
Yeah. My question was basically, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You were talking about the fact that, as a project manager, sometimes you need to wear two hats, and that is of an instructional designer and of a project manager, like, being the performer and the ringmaster, right? Mm-hmm. I face this situation many times that, you need to, and you need to develop. And sometimes it becomes, what's the best to manage the two? I know sometimes it becomes very difficult to play the two roles.
I'm getting a lot of feedback, static. Shri, I think your question was how do you manage the dual roles? Is that correct? Well, I'm going to assume that your question was, unless you want to put it in the chat box. Yes. Okay, thank you, Shri. We're having a couple mic issues, I think, right now. Shri, as I mentioned earlier, what I typically do, and I think it's a good recommendation, is I set time aside either first thing in the morning or late in the day to review my plans, to make sure that I'm on target, to make sure that I've communicated with the team members that I need to communicate with, that that I'm on track with everything I need to do, that I am prepared to give my client a status report at any time. So I set time aside, during the day to focus on my project management task, and then I can spend some of my time doing the instructional design pieces. Those are the pieces I like. Actually, to tell you the truth, I like to do them both. I like the variety that my job affords me. I do get to do a lot of different things. I get to be an instructional designer. I get to train. I get to do research. I get to manage projects. I get to manage e-learning projects, classroom instruction. It's nice to have the variety. I'm fortunate that way. So yeah, I have to chop up my time, and I do write myself a lot of notes. You know, I wish I had stock and Post-it. Frankly, I use a lot of Post-it notes to remind me to do things. I also, for really big projects, I will keep a whiteboard. I have a big whiteboard in my office, and I'll actually map out my work breakdown structure. And that way it's in my face every day. I don't have to open up a document to look at it. I walk in and there it is staring right at me. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my answer. You're welcome. Somebody asked a question. I'm trying to find it here in the list. Somebody asked a question about change management. And I was wondering if that was a big issue for someone.
Hey, Deb.
Yes.
Hey, this is Kim. I have a question. I'm training on the project I'm currently on. It falls underneath of change management.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure if I'm the one that asked the question you're referring to.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still looking at the list. Okay.
And I was just kind of wondering, at what point, though, should the training team be brought in to the loop when rolling out a development life cycle? Like, at what point do you bring in training and say, okay, we're in the development stage, let's bring the trainers in, or okay, we're just now beginning change requirement gatherings, we need to bring the trainers in so that they can sit in. Is there any part of a project where the trainers need to be brought in, because eventually they're going to be going out, they're going to need to develop the training and roll it out. So I was just wondering, is there any part of the process to where you feel it's pertinent for the trainers to begin to be included in the discussion, the gathering of the requirements, the development? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand the question, and I hear it a lot. I think that question gets asked a lot, actually.
A lot of times at the last minute.
Yeah, exactly. The trainers are brought in at the last minute, and then they're scrambling to learn a product, learn a software, and then they have to get out and teach it like the next week or something. I have the highest respect for trainers who are on the road, believe me. Well, again, I think it can be a cultural thing. I was fortunate many years ago to actually work for a software development company. And actually, they were the company that paid for my master's degree. They got kind of smart about it. They used to not have instructional designers or trainers. They had their developers write the training manuals as they were developing the software, and the end users hated it.
Yeah.
Because, they just couldn't stand it. So. Actually, I was brought in as a technical writer. This was a company that developed software to manage managed care companies, healthcare companies, and I was working at a managed care company writing insurance policy, and so I understood managed healthcare. And so they brought me in as a technical writer, and then they approached me and they said, hey, do you think you could write training? And I said, sure, why not? That's my response to everything. Sure, why not? So I quickly joined ASTD and then just started reading everything I could get my hands on to figure out how to design training and how was that different from technical documentation. And then that's how that kind of evolved into the UMBC thing. But that company actually, they got smart because they listened to their end users, and so they would allow the trainers and the instructional designers to be part of the development team, and the trainers and the designers understood the end users, and so they could say to a developer, hey, you like it because it makes the back end easy for you, but it makes it really hard on the user, or it's not intuitive to the user. And so I was fortunate in that regard. So if you can adjust the culture of your organization, I know that's hard.
We
but
tried.
Yeah, that's all you can do is just keep making the request. Or if you hear there's going to be, you know, a project starting, a development project starting, ask if you could be part of the team and, you know, be willing to review documents for them, et cetera, et cetera. Even if it means that, you know, you might not have billable hours to that project. Right. You might have to do it on your own time, but, you know, volunteer to do that and start to create that partnership.
So you say start at the very beginning when we're doing requirements gathering. Like
I mean, that would be
with the community saying those people that attend the gathering and get
that's an ideal situation. I know it doesn't always happen, but ideally that's what you would like to have happen.
Okay. Hey, I have another question for you.
Sure.
Do you think that to be a good project manager for training, you need to be an expert or have a lot of knowledge in every area that you're managing?
No. No. And no. No. Okay. I was tapped a couple of years ago to manage a project on emergency risk communication. I'm not a risk communicator. I'm not an emergency communicator. I'm not a health communicator. I am an instructional designer. That's how I introduce myself. I am an instructional designer. But because of my legendary project management skills, and because this was a particularly challenging client, I was asked to step in and manage a project where the end products were a website and newsletters, quarterly newsletters. My project team was in Atlanta. I am in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I never met anyone on the team.
Okay.
We had virtual meetings. I knew nothing about, you know, writing a newsletter. I did know a little bit of something about building websites. Mm-hmm. But that project turned out to be, despite the client having trouble communicating what it is she wanted, that project team actually worked pretty smoothly, and we were able to produce deliverables that the client was happy with.
Okay. Okay.
So, you know, you want to make sure that your team is pretty solid.
Right.
You know, I was fortunate I had a good team.
Okay.
You know, and sometimes they just need direction. They just need to stay on target, you know, and that's your role as the project manager, is just to keep everything moving forward.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, somebody asked if I think that a training manager needs to be certified in project management. Other folks asked about the there's a question here. Are you familiar with ASTD Project Management for Learning Professional Certificate? Would you recommend it? Well, I can say this. I do know that certification course was developed in partnership with Lou Russell, and I love, love, love her. I can't tell you enough. I did take a workshop with her a number of years ago. What is nice about that ASTD program is that you can earn professional development units towards your PMP if you're going to go in that direction. So many years ago when I started doing project management, I thought, shoot, you know, if you're really organized, you don't need to take a class to become certified in project management. You know, if you're a good project manager, you're a good project manager. But now what I'm seeing in the request for proposals from government agencies is that they are more and more requiring that someone on the team be a PMP. Whether it's a technology person or the instructional designer or the project director, but someone needs to have that PMP credential. I am seeing that more and more. So I would not discourage you from pursuing a PMP, if that's a career path that you want. Some people are not cut out for management, and they learn that very, very quickly. Well, I think that's all I have.
Deb, I
Unless
have one
there's
question.
anything else. Sure.
Okay, it's Michelle. One of my questions was, and you mentioned Microsoft Project. I was just curious if there were any other software that you favor for managing training projects?
I don't use any software at all. I use Word, and I use Excel. I am a table creating queen. I use tables for lots of things. And I use those tools just because they're handy to me. A number of years ago, the company I'm with now rolled out Microsoft Project for all the project managers, and on my side, I sit on the research side of the company, and I don't think any of the research team uses it to manage any of their projects. I think everybody's using paper and pencil. They found the project management software took up too much of their time. People get caught up in it, and they're always updating. And so unless you have a lot of time to devote to that, and also depending on the size of your project, I know that my IT team, those folks work on maybe more complicated projects, and they will use the Microsoft Project software, and they find it helpful. But I find it a little too cumbersome. I tend not to use it.
So Deb, do you use
Thank
any
you.
type of collaboration tools?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We use SharePoint, which is nice because our external team members can access SharePoint without getting into our network drives. So we use SharePoint quite a bit. We use WebEx as a virtual meeting tool as well.
So is that where you post SharePoint, is where you post your project, your Word or your Excel spreadsheet into SharePoint, and then from there everybody can go in and see the project schedule and their tasks and things like that? Is that how you, or do you utilize SharePoint actually as, because SharePoint has that feature to where you can actually kind of manage projects within there?
Yeah, I haven't explored it that fully, and but I like SharePoint. I actually used SharePoint to develop a knowledge management system a few years ago for CDC, and I really liked the features that SharePoint had to offer in terms of a knowledge management system.
Okay.
I just don't. My projects right now are not large enough to really warrant a lot of effort into the SharePoint, and my project team sits right next door to me, so it's very easy for me to stick my head in their door and have conversations with them.
Okay.
Well, I hope to see some of you in my class in the fall.
I think it's a great
it'll be
class.
a good time. Yeah, and I want to thank you again for inviting me to speak tonight, Greg.
Sure.
I enjoyed it. A lot of good questions tonight.
One of the things that I've learned, and a lot of other people have learned this too, is that one way to move up in our field is to take on more management capabilities or projects.
Oh my God.
Getting a little feedback there from somebody, I'm not sure. And project management is clearly one way to do that, because most of the organizations that I talk to and job descriptions that I see, they don't want somebody just being an instructional designer and that's all they do. They want someone who can do a variety of things, and usually project management is on the list. So I think it's very, very helpful.
Hello, Greg. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I've been trying to get this for a while. I actually have a question. I typed it in, but I didn't get a response.
Okay.
Is this Rolanda?
Yes.
I didn't
And
see it
your
in the
question-
chat. Sorry.
It said, I asked a question about managing change. Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, I was one of the
just.
ones who asked the question about change management.
Oh, okay. Well, I just sent you a private message because I just caught it. Yeah, I think communication is key, and you know the project team, you know, handles a set of tasks within a project, but when you have a change initiative going on organizationally, is that the type of change you're talking about? Organizational change?
Yes, where maybe, so I use the example of a level of expertise where all of a sudden the client has, you know, a big change, so now you might need to swap out some of your team members to, you know, get the expertise you need to get the job done. How does that work?
Oh, change within the project, not organizational, not a
Yeah.
you know, an organizational change initiative, but change within your project.
Yes.
Well, let's see. Let me think this through, because this is what I am going through now. I told you that I had a small project where initially the client thought that they were going to have a webinar. And now it looks like that's not going to happen. So when we responded to the request for proposal and we did the pricing, we based it all on doing a 508 compliant webinar that would require you know, an outside vendor to do the closed captioning, my graphic designers to develop the templates that would be used. We already have WebEx, so that was not an issue. But now, because I advised them that a webinar was definitely not the way to go for this project, I am now having to sit back and think, who do I need to engage if I am going to recommend that they produce a blog or a mobile app. That was one of the recommendations that they liked, you know, to push messages out. So mobile app is certainly going to take a lot more effort, I think, than preparing a blog. And so what I have to do is now price things out. I've already had the conversation with the client. We talked very briefly about the recommendations and the new direction for the project. And you know, people understand your business needs. And so I said, well, you know, I think these are all great ideas. I mean, after all, I recommended them. I think they're all great ideas, but we need to step back and see what kind of contract modification we need and how this is going to impact the cost of the project. It might not have an impact on the cost, but I need to still price it out and do a comparison. We don't want to lose any money, and your clients don't want you to lose any money either. Otherwise, you're not going to bid on their projects anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So someone had asked that question. You know, how do you talk to your client about scope? How do you talk about scope creep nicely? I think was the question. Something like that. But people understand, you know, that you have business needs, and it's okay to have that conversation and not to say yes to everything right away, but to say, give me a minute and let me see how that impacts the bottom line and what changes we might have to make.
Okay. And that would be the same with the your team. If you have to say to someone in your team that, you know, the scope of the project has changed, and so we will no longer, you know, need your expertise. That's basically what you
absolutely. Yeah, and it's not personal, it's business.
Right.
And so, Rolanda, you just put a big smile on your face and, you know, have that kind of empathy for that person, and, you know, people understand. They probably have other projects to move on to. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
And earlier I did want to mention that was something else I remember you touched on in the class that I thought was very helpful for project managers to just know how to deal with the team that they're working with. We had a whole discussion on that. I remember one time in class of, how to treat them and how to let them know, give them feedback, and bring them up to par as far as their performance and things. So that was something we did discuss as well, dealing with the client and also dealing with your team, that communication.
Right. Yeah, that relationship you have with your team is really important. I mean, you can make work fun or you can make work a chore. And I always choose to have fun.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Deb, this is Vivian. I have a question. When you were talking about the organizational change and the question that you received, I had submitted a question about that as far as when you're managing organizational change and getting communications out. What are some best practices other than email to communicate change? Like right now, at my job, we're going through process change and trying to inform the community of the changes that are going to be happening with the process. What is a better way of communicating that other than through email?
Well, there are a couple ways to do it. And again, it depends on your organization and how they're set up. If you have regularly scheduled like all hands meetings where executive management might give a presentation, that might be the time that
Yes.
one of the executives talks about the change. Another thing would be to have your executive manager, your CEO, the president of your organization, someone high level, could produce a monthly newsletter. That's helpful. That keeps people engaged. People feel like they know what's going on in the company when they receive frequent communications. And change, at that level it needs to be communicated from a really high level. I could suggest to you that you look at the ADKAR model of change, ADKAR.
ADKAR?
Uh-huh. And it's a model that it was developed by a group called ProSci, P-R-O-S-C-I. I think if you type that in, the Google search engine, you'll come up with it. Or you can even type in ADKAR, A-D-K-A-R, and you'll come up with their model of change. That's a real popular model to follow. And the first A stands for awareness. You have to first create awareness of the change. The D is just desire. You have to create desire. The K is knowledge. You have to teach people about the change that's going to happen. You have to give people the ability to make the change, and then you have to. The R stands for, I believe it stands for reinforce. But you can look that up online, but that's a useful model to look at, and I believe you'll also find information on that site about how to communicate change through the different channels of the organization.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any burning questions for Deb? I know, we asked that you submit questions, and we don't want to leave without answering a question you thought was very important for you. I'm not hearing anything. Okay.
They're tapped out. Maybe they're going to save questions for me for the fall when they come to my class.
Maybe.
Hey, Deb, this is Allie.
Yeah. Hey, Al.
So my question, I almost don't want to ask it because I don't think that there's an immediate answer, but our organization is going through a big change. We're located in New York City, and we are expanding immediately to large parts of New York State, and by the end of the year throughout the whole state. And as part of that, there'll be creating regional offices and hiring people out there, and we'll be doing, the education team will be doing a lot of work with orientation out in those regions and stuff. And it's just, I work for a manager. I want to be kind and say that she was promoted to a management position from some other position that stopped, and she's not a manager. She was never trained to be a manager and doesn't have really a lot of skill sets about management. And I can predict a lot of big problems coming for us. We have a team with most of the people on the team have families. They're not going to be able to travel all over the state for long periods of time or even for weeks at a time. I'm not sure that I can articulate my question. I want a miracle. Do you have any of those?
No, I ran out.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about like what are the things that the most critical. The first thing that pops into my head is establishing some communication that's remote communication, like webinars, and we have some video conferencing ability, and making sure we have everybody up to speed on that. But beyond that, I think it's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, yeah, and to really use that time wisely. When you're reaching out to those folks, those remote folks.
Yeah, don't waste it.
Yeah, don't waste that time. Really have, have a strong agenda. Maybe make other people responsible. Have people take turns for being responsible for the agenda and for running the meeting. But always have a purpose to your meetings. You know how it is. There's nothing worse than sitting in a meeting and wondering, why you're there. You got so much other stuff to do. So, make the time worthwhile. And you can always make meetings fun, too, even virtually. Yes. So I work with a manager who loves YouTube, so we're always looking forward to see what new YouTube video they're going to try to tie into the purpose of the meeting.
Right. YouTube has taken the place of little clips from movies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm sorry I didn't have a miracle for you.
That's all right. At least I got to say it out loud that I'm afraid.
It's that first step sometimes.
Hi, Deb. This is Candace. Hello?
Hey, Candace. Long time no see.
I know. I was trying to ask a question, but I was having trouble with my mic. But when you were talking about the 3 phases, initiation, execution, and closeout, I was just, I guess, trying to figure out what would you say. I mean, they're all important, but would you say initiation is probably the most critical step out of those 3? Because you're trying to, I guess, get together your team and, delegate, what needs to be done. Would you say that's the most critical part of it?
No. You know what? I think they're all critical, and I think that if you look at the expanded phases, like the PMBOK phases, so you have initiation, planning, execution, monitoring and controlling, and closeout. Planning, to me, is where you really need to put a lot of your effort. It is so much better to plan than not plan. So they're all important steps to seeing a project through to a successful conclusion, but planning is pretty critical.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Hi, Deb, this is Shri.
Hi, Shri.
Have you ever encountered any situation when you had to step into a project which was already being managed by somebody else, and that person left or needed to be replaced, and then you are in a situation where, a totally different, because each person has a different set of practices of project management. So have you had any situation where you've had to kind of, get into a project and then steer it to success, considering the fact that it's being managed by somebody else, and now there's someone else with the project management expectations and practices?
Right. I had that happen a lot, actually. No, I'm not kidding. I've had that. I've referred to 2 of them in tonight's presentation. One was this risk management project. The the project manager left the company, and then it was interesting. Right when I was ready to pass the baton to someone else who was co-located with the group of health communicators that I was managing, the government project officer also moved on, and another project officer came in. So that timing was actually perfect. That was a good time for me to pass the baton to someone else. So we had a DANYA project manager, a new DANYA project manager working with a brand new government client, and so they could steer the project the way they wanted to steer it. But I've had to step in. I spoke tonight about a project where I got in. Someone had been managing it. She left to go to graduate school. I started looking at all the pieces that had already been done and realized that that no one had ever. It was to develop a knowledge management system, and no one had ever defined who was going to use the knowledge management system, and which was critical. But I was really excited because I had worked with a government project officer before when I was with another company, and I really liked her a lot. We got along really well. We used to travel around the country a lot together, and I thought, oh, this will be fun. It's like Old Home Week. And so when I called her to say, hey, you know, they just turned this project over to me, she said, oh, well, I'm sorry to tell you, she says, I'm moving on to another division within the organization. So I didn't get to work with her at all. But it happens, and you sort it out, and you know, you create relationships, and it gets done.
Sometimes, sometimes it can get a bit nasty too. You know,
with the team, well, it can with the team if your team was really sort of devoted to the other manager, or that you know they like that management style. And sometimes you have to kind of step back and figure out how you have to adjust your style instead of making your team adjust to you. You might have to make some adjustments for them, but you just have to keep focused on that end goal. What do you have to do to, you know, to reach that goal line?
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions from our group? Well, okay. I'm not hearing anything. I don't see any chats or questions popping up, so I guess we have our questions answered for now.
Very good.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Deb to share her time and expertise with us. She's always very generous, and I want to thank her very much. So, Deb, thank you very much. We all appreciate
You're very
it.
welcome.
Thanks, Deb.
Thank you all. Thanks for hanging in there. Thanks for the great questions. I appreciate it. Had a great time tonight.
This is Kim.
Oh, very good. Okay, I'll look for you in the fall then.
Great.
All right. So, Deb, again, thank you very much. And what we're going to do, folks, is I'm going to, unless anybody has any additional questions for me beyond Deb's presentation, we can say goodnight to everyone. Does anyone have any questions in general about the course or anything at all? I don't have an answer to the meaning of life, but...
Greg, are we going to get any feedback on a reflection paper, or are you just looking at it to see like growth from where we were at the beginning of the course?
Yeah, I'll give you some feedback, but you know, in general, it's, you know, it is kind of like the meaning of life. I mean, there is no one right or wrong answer, but what I found helpful over the years is just to have people think about, well, where am I now? And then a period of time goes by, and you kind of reflect and say, okay, so where am I at this point? And usually reflection is usually a pretty helpful learning activity. So, you know, I'm not going to chime in and say that your reflection's right or wrong, but it's like, yeah, you did some hard thinking. That's good because.
No, that made me think of something. What we use at my school all the time when we're meeting in teams is we say, where are we now? Where are we going? And
Right.
where do we want to be?
Right.
So,
and
so that was good.
Right. And without thinking, that's pretty hard to do, that exercise. I mean, I had a student tell me once in a different course, and you know, once in a while, things fall into place, and somebody said, you know, and it was on the project, the portfolio development. Somebody said to me,